It started long before the raids, before the headlines, before anyone knew their names. Isidor Izzy Einstein was born in 1880 somewhere inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire into a Jewish family shaped by tradition and survival. He grew up speaking Yiddish first, then picked up Hungarian, Polish, and German along the way. Language came easy to him. It would later become one of his most effective tools. Around 1901, as a young man, he left Europe behind and arrived in the United States, settling into the crowded, restless streets of New York. Life there wasn't generous. Einstein worked whatever jobs he could find, starting as a salesman and later taking a position as a postal clerk. The pay was steady, but never enough. He supported not only his wife Esther, whom he married around 1906, but a growing family. They would have several children, and not all of them survived early childhood. That kind of loss was common at the time, but it left a mark. Mo W. Smith came from a different starting point. He was born around 1887, right in New York City. No immigration story, no language barrier. His world was already American, rough around the edges, built on hustle. As a young man, he stepped into the boxing ring for a time, then moved into business, running a cigar shop and managing a small fight club. He understood people, how they moved, how they talked, how they reacted under pressure. Before Prohibition ever entered the picture, both men were living ordinary lives. Working class, trying to stay ahead of bills, responsibilities, and expectations. Smith would later marry Sadie Strauss, a Jewish immigrant from Bohemia who had come to New York speaking Yiddish, much like Einstein years earlier. Together, they built a small family of their own. By the early 1900s, nothing about these two men suggested what was coming. No badge, no reputation, no legend. Just two men moving through the same city, not yet knowing their paths were about to collide. By the early 1900s, both men were already deep into the grind of everyday life in New York. There were no uniforms, no authority, no hint of federal work, just long hours and limited options. Izzy Einstein worked as a salesman at first, moving goods, dealing with customers, learning how to read people quickly. It was honest work, but unpredictable. He later took a job as a postal clerk, sorting mail for the federal government. The position brought stability, but not much else. The pay barely covered what he needed. He wasn't supporting only a household, he was carrying the weight of a large family, including his children and his father. Every dollar had a destination before it even reached his pocket. There was no glamour in it, just repetition. Early mornings, long shifts, responsibility that didn't let up. Mo Smith's path ran through a different part of the same city. He spent time as a boxer, stepping into small fights that paid little and demanded everything. It gave him toughness, but not security. He eventually moved into business, working as a cigar salesman before opening his own cigar shop. For a while, he also managed a small fight club, staying close to the world he came from. Smith understood risk. He knew how to handle unpredictable situations, how to stay calm when things turned physical. But like Einstein, he was still building something that could hold steady. Neither man had any formal training in law enforcement, no police background, no investigative experience. Nothing that would suggest they'd one day be trusted to enforce a federal law across one of the largest cities in the country. They were working men, trying to get by, and waiting, without realizing it, for an opportunity that didn't exist yet. By 1917, the ground was already shifting across the United States. What had started as a moral campaign driven by religious groups and reformers was turning into federal law. That year, the 18th Amendment was passed by Congress, aiming to outlaw the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. In 1919, it was ratified by the required number of states, locking it into the Constitution. Then came the Volstead Act, which gave the government the power to enforce it. At midnight on January 16, 1920, Prohibition became reality. On paper, it looked like control. In practice, it triggered something else entirely. Almost overnight, the country adapted. Drinking didn't stop, it moved, it went underground. Across the United States, an estimated 200,000 illegal bars opened up, They called them speakeasies, blind pigs, backroom joints. Some were hidden behind steel doors and passwords. Others operated in plain sight, known to everyone except the law. New York became a center of it all. By the mid-1920s, tens of thousands of speakeasies were operating across the city, more than the number of legal saloons before Prohibition. In places like Chicago and Detroit, the numbers climbed just as fast. Entire neighborhoods adjusted to the new reality. Wine was made in apartments. Alcohol was brewed in bathtubs. Hardware stores sold stills. Explosions from homemade equipment became part of the news cycle. And where there was demand, organized crime moved in. Bootleggers built supply chains that stretched across borders. Liquor came down from Canada, across waterways, through back roads into cities that were already waiting for it. Gangs handled distribution, protection, and enforcement. They built networks, fought rivals, and paid off whoever they needed to keep things moving. The law created a market. The market created power, and the government wasn't ready for what came with it. To enforce Prohibition, thousands of agents were recruited into the newly formed Prohibition Bureau. Many had no experience. Some didn't last. Corruption spread quickly. Bribes, extortion, falsified reports, agents switching sides. Out of nearly 18,000 appointments in the early years, the majority were eventually dismissed for misconduct. The system was overwhelmed from the start. Too many bars, too much money, too many people willing to look the other way. And in the middle of it, the government needed men who could operate inside that world, men who didn't look like the law. By 1920, the law was in place. The country had gone dry, at least on paper. What the government didn't have was enough men to enforce it. The Prohibition Bureau began recruiting fast. Standards dropped. Experience became optional. They needed bodies, and they needed them immediately. That's when Izzy Einstein walked into the Manhattan office and applied. At first glance, he didn't fit the image. He wasn't athletic. He didn't carry himself like a detective. Even the bureau saw it and turned him away. He looked more like a customer than an officer, more like the kind of man who would be sitting at the bar, not shutting it down. Einstein didn't argue the point. He leaned into it. He told them that was exactly why he would succeed. No one would suspect him. He could walk into places other agents couldn't. He didn't need to chase anyone down. He could outthink them. Blend in, listen, get served, then make the arrest. It was a different kind of approach, less force, more deception. The Bureau gave him a chance, and he became Prohibition Agent number 1. Not long after, he brought in someone he trusted, Mo Smith. Smith had no law enforcement background either, but he understood people, pressure, and risk. The two men already knew each other, likely through shared circles in New York, including Masonic connections. Einstein saw what Smith could bring to the job and convinced him to join. Now it was a partnership. Two men with no formal training, no traditional credentials, no resemblance to what federal agents were supposed to look like. They were based in New York City, right in the middle of the largest illegal alcohol market in the country. And that worked in their favor. Because in a city full of bootleggers, bartenders, and backroom deals, the last thing anyone expected was that the man sitting next to them might be the law. Once they were inside the system, Einstein and Smith had to figure out how to survive in it. The Prohibition Bureau didn't hand them a real playbook. Most agents were expected to knock on doors, follow tips, and make arrests when they could. That approach didn't last long in cities like New York. Speakeasies were hidden, protected, and often backed by organized groups who knew how to spot a cop before he even spoke. Einstein understood early that force wouldn't work, so he built something else. He called it the Einstein theory of rum snooping. It wasn't written down anywhere official, but the idea was simple. If you want to catch a man selling illegal liquor, you don't chase him. You become his customer. You sit where he sits. You talk the way he talks, and you wait until he hands you the evidence himself. That meant going in unarmed. Einstein and Smith rarely carried weapons. They relied on timing, positioning, and surprise. It was a risk every time they stepped through a door. Most of the places they entered were controlled environments filled with people who had something to lose. One wrong move and they wouldn't be walking out. What made it work was Einstein's ability to blend in. He spoke multiple languages: Yiddish, Hungarian, German, Polish, and others, and used them to move through immigrant neighborhoods that other agents couldn't penetrate. In those communities, trust didn't come easy, and outsiders stood out immediately. Einstein didn't. He could pass as a local, a traveler, a worker looking for a drink after a long day. Smith played his role beside him, steady, observant, ready to act when the moment came. Then came the disguises. They didn't use one or two. They used dozens. Over time, more than 100 different identities. They showed up as laborers, salesmen, fishermen, gravediggers, icemen, even performers. At times, they walked into establishments openly, with Einstein introducing himself as a prohibition agent, knowing no one would believe him. The joke worked in their favor. Other times, the deception was more careful. They would build a situation, gain trust, get served, and only then reveal who they were. Everything depended on access. Access to the room, access to the bottle, access to the moment when the law had been broken. By 1921, they weren't following the system anymore. They were rewriting how it worked. By the early 1920s, Prohibition had created something far bigger than the government expected. It wasn't a law being enforced, it was a system being built around breaking it. Across the country, illegal alcohol production expanded at a scale that mirrored legitimate industry. In New York City alone, tens of thousands of speakeasies replaced the old saloons. By some estimates, there were more illegal drinking spots than there had ever been legal ones. Chicago followed the same pattern with over 10,000 speakeasies by 1925. Detroit became another major hub, its numbers climbing into the tens of thousands as well. Supply had to match demand. And it did. Alcohol was coming from everywhere. Large operations imported liquor from Canada and overseas, moving it through ports, back roads, and hidden routes. In places like New York, the waterfront became a pipeline. In upstate regions, routes like the Saratoga Bootleg Trail carried shipments south, often under armed protection. At the same time, smaller operations filled in the gaps. People brewed alcohol in apartments, tenements, even bathtubs. Hardware stores openly sold stills. Entire neighborhoods turned into production zones, with wine and liquor being made, sold, and consumed within the same streets. This wasn't random, it was organized. Street gangs evolved into structured operations. They handled supply chains, distribution networks, enforcement, and money laundering. They fought rivals, protected territory, and paid off anyone who stood in the way. What started as bootlegging quickly became the foundation for larger criminal organizations that would dominate the next decade. And inside the system meant to stop it. Things were already breaking down. The Prohibition Bureau expanded rapidly, hiring thousands of agents in a short time. Many weren't qualified. Some didn't last. Corruption spread almost immediately. Bribery became routine. Agents looked the other way for the right price. Others actively participated, using their knowledge to assist the very operations they were supposed to shut down. Out of nearly 18,000 appointments in the early years, around 16,000 agents were eventually dismissed for misconduct. The charges covered everything: bribery, extortion, falsifying records, conspiracy. The Bureau developed a reputation not as an enforcement agency, but as a place where lines could be crossed without consequence. Even local law enforcement wasn't immune. In New York, police officers were often tied into the same system. Some protected speakeasies, others warned bootleggers ahead of raids. There were cases where officers interfered directly with federal operations, giving criminals time to clear out before arrests could be made. The result was a city and a country where the law existed, but control didn't. Too many operations and too much money moving. Too many people compromised. This was the environment Einstein and Smith walked into every night. Not a clean fight, a crowded one. By 1921, Einstein and Smith weren't experimenting anymore. They had found their rhythm. What started as an unconventional approach turned into one of the most effective enforcement operations in the country. Night after night, they moved through New York and beyond, entering speakeasies, building cases, and making arrests in places other agents couldn't even access. Their numbers began to climb fast. Between 1920 and 1925, they made over 4,900 arrests. Around 95% of those cases ended in convictions, a rate that stood far above the rest of the Bureau. They also confiscated an estimated 5 million gallons of liquor, valued in the millions. The method stayed the same. Get inside, get served, make the case. They used disguises constantly, not as a gimmick, but as a necessity. They walked in as laborers, salesmen, fishermen, even performers. In one case, they posed as delegates from Kentucky at the 1924 Democratic National Convention in New York. They moved through crowds, tested locations, and confirmed that alcohol was being served where it wasn't supposed to be. In Detroit, Einstein used the same instincts. He entered a speakeasy disguised as an auto worker and was refused service at first. The bartender pointed to a photograph behind the bar and said the place was on alert because Izzy Epstein was in town. Einstein corrected him, made a bet over a drink, collected the evidence, and then revealed who he was. In Saratoga Springs, their presence became routine. From 1921 through 1925, they made repeated trips to the area, targeting hotels, restaurants, and known liquor spots. One of their early raids involved arrests at R.H. Melifont's hotel. They returned again in later years, hitting multiple locations, including businesses that had already been warned and caught before. They didn't just rely on disguises, they created situations. In one case, Einstein joined a polar bear swimming group in the middle of winter to gain access to a location. Nearly frozen, he was rushed inside by Smith, who called for a drink to warm him up. The bartender served it without hesitation. That was all they needed. Every operation followed the same principle. The crime had to happen in front of them. No assumptions, no second-hand reports, direct evidence. By 1924, they weren't just effective. They were known. Speakeasies began posting their photographs behind the bar, warning staff and customers. It didn't stop them. If anything, it added another layer to the game. Einstein would sometimes bet patrons that he was the man in the photo. When they took the bet and lost, he made the arrest. City by city, case by case, they kept moving. Not with force, with access. By 1922, Einstein and Smith had figured out something most agents ignored. Enforcement didn't have to stay quiet. It could be seen. It could be followed. And if it was handled right, it could work in their favor. They began coordinating their raids with the press. Reporters and photographers were often told in advance where they would be and when they would move. It wasn't accidental. It was planned. They understood that newspapers needed stories and Prohibition needed visibility. Timing became part of the strategy. They noticed that Monday papers had more space to fill, so they scheduled major operations on Sundays. That way, the raids would dominate the headlines the next morning. It gave their work reach, and it gave the Bureau something it was struggling to maintain: public confidence. When they moved, they didn't move quietly. One Sunday, accompanied by a crowd of reporters, they carried out 71 raids in just over 12 hours. It became a record, not just for them, but for the entire Bureau. The press followed every step, documenting arrests, seizures, and the pace of the operation as it unfolded across the city. The public started to recognize them. Newspapers wrote about their methods, their disguises, their ability to outmaneuver bootleggers. Stories spread across local and national outlets. They were described as effective, relentless, and at times even entertaining. Their cases were real, but the way they operated gave the public something more than enforcement. It gave them a story they could follow. Einstein, in particular, became the central figure. His personality, his language skills, his willingness to take risks, it all translated well on paper. Headlines focused on him, often presenting him as the driving force behind the operations. Smith remained beside him, steady and consistent, but the spotlight leaned heavily toward Einstein. The attention kept growing. Their names appeared regularly in major publications, including papers like the New York Times. Other outlets refer to Einstein as a leading figure among federal agents, highlighting the scale of their arrests and the consistency of their convictions. Inside the Bureau, that attention didn't sit well with everyone. Because while the public saw results, the leadership saw something else. 2 agents becoming bigger than the system they worked for. And that kind of visibility always comes with a cost. By 1923, the stakes had changed. What started as illegal drinking had grown into something heavier, something armed, organized, and willing to use force to protect itself. The flow of alcohol into major cities depended on routes that stretched across borders and state lines. One of those paths ran through upstate New York, known as the Saratoga Bootleg Trail. It carried liquor down from Canada, moving through small towns and into larger markets where demand never slowed. That route became contested ground. Smugglers didn't move alone, shipments were guarded, rival groups watched for opportunities to intercept, steal, or shut down competitors. The road wasn't just a supply line, it was a place where control was tested. Shootouts became part of that reality. Hijackings, ambushes, and roadside confrontations were reported along the trail, especially in and around Saratoga Springs. Local gangs, independent operators, and organized crews all moved through the same space, often crossing paths with predictable results. In the fall of 1923, the violence reached a point that couldn't be ignored. State Trooper Roy Donovan was shot and killed by bandits along the bootleg route, about 5 miles north of Saratoga Springs. It wasn't an isolated incident, but it became a clear signal of how far things had gone. Law enforcement wasn't just chasing illegal alcohol anymore. They were stepping into armed conflict. The response came quickly. Federal authorities reassigned dozens of agents to the Saratoga district, aiming to regain control of the route. Local officials escalated as well. Police were issued sawed-off shotguns and instructed to act without hesitation when confronting suspected smugglers. The message was direct. The situation had moved beyond routine enforcement. At the same time, smuggling networks adapted. Operators like A.J. Patniode and Louis Doc Ferrone used side streets and secondary roads to avoid detection. They moved shipments quietly when they could and aggressively when they had to. The business was too profitable to slow down, even with the increased risk. And this wasn't limited to Saratoga. Across the country, organized groups were building similar systems. They imported liquor, controlled distribution, handled enforcement, and protected their territory. What had started as scattered bootlegging was now structured, coordinated, and increasingly violent. Einstein and Smith were still working during this period, still making arrests, still entering rooms unarmed. But the environment around them was shifting. The men they were chasing weren't just bartenders and small operators anymore. They were part of something bigger, and that something was starting to push back. By late 1925, the work stopped, not because the job was done, because someone higher up decided it was. In November of that year, Einstein and Smith were dismissed from the Prohibition Bureau as part of a broader reorganization. Officially, it was administrative. Unofficially, it came down to visibility. They had become too well-known, too closely associated with the success of enforcement, and that attention didn't sit well with leadership in Washington. There were reports at the time suggesting that senior officials, including those appointed to oversee the Bureau, were uncomfortable with how much press the 2 agents received. Their names appeared more often than the names of the people running the agency. That imbalance carried consequences, so they were let go. Just like that, the most productive team in the system was out. After 1925, both men stepped away from law enforcement and moved into private business. They entered the insurance industry and built new careers during a period that included the economic strain of the Great Depression. Despite the conditions, they managed to do well. Einstein worked with the New York Life Insurance Company, rebuilding stability in a different line of work. In 1932, Einstein published an autobiography titled Prohibition Agent No. 1. It detailed the cases, the methods, and the years spent inside a system that was already fading. The book reached a wide audience with hundreds of thousands of readers, many of whom had followed their work in the newspapers years earlier. Prohibition itself was nearing its end. The country had changed. Public opinion had shifted. The system that once demanded enforcement was now questioning its own foundation. Einstein didn't live to see much beyond that shift. On February the 17th, 1938, he died at the age of 57, just days after undergoing a leg amputation. He was buried in Mount Zion Cemetery in Queens, New York. Mo Smith lived longer. He remained in New York out of the spotlight until 1960, when he died from a stroke in Yonkers. By then, Prohibition was history, but their record remained. Nearly 5,000 arrests, millions of gallons of liquor seized, a conviction rate that set them apart from every other agent in the Bureau. At the time of their deaths, national publications looked back on their work and described them as one of the most effective teams the federal government had ever put into the field. Not because they followed the system, because they figured out how to work inside it. And for a few years, in a country that couldn't control its own law, they came closer than anyone else.